It was just another ordinary day at his modest garage when Frank, a struggling mechanic in a small town, crossed paths with a single mom in desperate need of help. Her car was on the verge of breaking down, and her finances were stretched thin. Moved by her story and the bright smile of her young son, Frank made a decision that would change his life forever. He fixed her car for free, never expecting anything in return. What he didn't know was that this act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would lead to a gift so extraordinary it would turn his world upside down. But what was the gift? And who was this single mom really? Before we dive into this heartwarming tale of generosity, resilience, and unexpected surprises, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. By doing so, you'll never miss another inspiring story that might just brighten your day or even change your perspective. Now, let's begin this incredible journey with Frank, whose small act of kindness opened the door to something far greater than he could have ever imagined. A mechanic fixed a single mom's car for free. Later, he received a life-changing gift. Frank wiped his grease-streaked hands on a worn rag, the faint hum of classic rock from the radio filling the quiet garage. At 28, the young mechanic had long accepted the solitude of his life in rural Maine. He found comfort in routine, the clang of tools, the smell of oil, and the satisfaction of a job well done. Yet, beneath the calm exterior, there was an unshakable emptiness. Frank had lost his mother at a young age and knew little about his father, who had disappeared before Frank could even form memories of him. The winter morning was crisp, the kind that painted the windows with frost. Frank was about to close up for a short lunch when the faint rumble of a struggling engine echoed outside. He stepped to the garage entrance and saw a faded sedan crawling into view, sputtering as it came to an unsteady stop. From the driver's seat emerged a young woman, bundled in an oversized coat, her face flushed with a mix of frustration and embarrassment. She hurriedly opened the back door to help her son, a boy no older than 5, who hopped out clutching a small toy car. "Hi, I think something's wrong with my car," the woman said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It barely made it here." Frank glanced at the vehicle, the smoke rising faintly from under the hood, and the uneven hum told him all he needed to know. "Let me take a look," he said simply, grabbing his toolbox. As Frank popped the hood and assessed the damage, the woman knelt beside her son, brushing stray snowflakes from his hair. She looked over at Frank nervously. "I'm Carla," she offered, her voice warmer now. "This is Alex. We're new in town." Frank nodded, but remained focused on the engine. "Frank," he replied curtly. Carla glanced at the tools lined neatly on the workbench and back at Frank, unsure if her introduction had been welcome. Alex, meanwhile, was less hesitant. "Do you fix lots of cars?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Frank looked up briefly and nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, I do. You like cars?" Alex nodded enthusiastically, holding up his toy car. "I want to fix cars like this someday." "Well, maybe when you're older you can," Frank said, returning to his work. Carla stepped closer, her face softening. "He's really into anything with wheels. Keeps me busy." She hesitated before adding, "We just moved here. It's been a bit of a transition." Frank glanced at her briefly and noticed the weariness in her eyes, a heaviness he recognized. "All too well. Where from?" "Upstate New York. After my husband passed, I needed a fresh start." She lowered her voice. "It's just the two of us now." Frank didn't reply immediately. He knew better than most what it felt like to face the world alone. After a few more minutes of tinkering, he stepped back and wiped his hands. "Your alternator's shot," he said. "Battery's barely holding on." Carla's face fell. "How much will it cost to fix?" Frank could see the answer already forming in her expression. She didn't have it. He looked at Alex, now engrossed, in a row of spare parts on the bench, and then back at Carla. "Don't worry about it," he said finally. "What? No, I can't." "You can," Frank interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "I'll fix it." Carla blinked, momentarily stunned. "I don't know what to say." "Thank you," Frank shrugged. "You said you just moved here, right? Consider it a welcome gift." While Frank worked, Carla stayed close, striking up conversation despite his quiet demeanor. She told him about her struggles, raising Alex alone, the challenges of relocating, and her hopes of finding stable work in town. Her words painted a picture of resilience, though Frank could hear the cracks of vulnerability beneath her strength. "I used to bring Alex to visit my parents before they passed," Carla said, her voice growing wistful. "We'd stop in this little town along the way, Silver Ridge. Ever heard of it?" Frank froze momentarily, her words stirring something buried deep in his memory. "Silver Ridge," he repeated, the name unfamiliar and yet strangely significant. "Yeah," Carla continued, oblivious to his reaction. "It's a quiet place. My parents had friends there. Nice people." Frank nodded absently, his mind suddenly elsewhere. Silver Ridge. The name lingered, tethered to vague recollections of his mother's stories told long ago. By the time Frank finished the repair, dusk had begun to settle over the town. Carla loaded Alex into the car and turned to Frank, her gratitude evident in her expression. "I don't know how to thank you," she said earnestly. "If there's anything I can do—" Frank shook his head. "Just drive safe," he replied, stepping back as the engine roared to life under her relieved smile. As Carla drove off, Frank stood at the edge of the garage, watching until her car disappeared into the twilight. For the first time in years, a flicker of curiosity stirred within him. Silver Ridge. The name refused to fade, pulling at threads of a story he had long forgotten. Frank turned back toward the garage, his gaze falling on the wooden box perched on a high shelf. It had been there for years, untouched. As the faint memory of his mother's voice echoed in his mind, Frank made a decision. Tomorrow he would open the box. Frank stared at the old wooden box, sitting high on the shelf above his workbench. It had been there for years, collecting dust, a relic of a life he had long tried to move past. His mother had left it for him before she passed, but he had never been able to bring himself to open it. The ache of her absence had been too sharp, the questions about her life too overwhelming. Now, Carla's offhand mention of Silver Ridge had stirred something he couldn't ignore. He reached up, his hand brushing against the rough wood as he pulled the box down. It was heavier than he remembered, its weight more than just physical. Frank set the box on the bench, staring at the latch. His mind raced with questions. What if opening it uncovered something painful? What if it changed the way he remembered his mother? With a deep breath, he flipped the latch and lifted the lid. The contents were simple, but deeply personal. Letters, photographs, and a few trinkets lay neatly arranged inside, each item carefully preserved. Frank's fingers trembled as he picked up a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was unmistakably his mother's, elegant and precise. He unfolded the first letter, his heart pounding. It was addressed to no one, more like a diary entry than a correspondence. "I don't know how to explain this to him when he's older. I'm afraid of what he'll think of me, of the choices I made, but I hope more than anything he'll understand I did it all for him." Frank set the letter down, his chest tightening. The words hinted at a burden his mother had carried alone, one she had shielded him from. He sifted through the letters, finding similar reflections, fragments of a story she had never told him. Among the papers, a photograph caught his eye. It was an old black-and-white image of his mother, younger and smiling, standing in front of a grand house. On the back, written in her neat handwriting, was a single word: Silver Ridge. Frank stared at the name, his mind racing. Carla had mentioned That place just hours ago, and now here it was, tied directly to his mother. The connection was undeniable, but the details were maddeningly elusive. Beneath the photograph was another item, a small folded note with a single name written on it. Eleanor. Frank frowned. The name meant nothing to him, yet it felt significant. As if it were a piece of a puzzle he didn't yet know how to assemble. The hours ticked by as Frank sat at his workbench, sorting through the box's contents. The more he read, the more questions arose. Why had his mother never told him about Silver Ridge? Who was Eleanor? And what had she meant in her letters about making sacrifices for him? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows. Across the garage, Frank leaned back in his chair. His mind was a storm of emotions, curiosity, frustration, and a growing determination to uncover the truth. But with that determination came fear. What if the answers weren't what he hoped? What if they revealed a side of his mother he didn't want to see? The sound of footsteps startled him. Carla appeared at the open garage door, Alex holding her hand. "I brought you some dinner," Carla said, setting a container on the workbench. She glanced at the open box, her eyes curious but not prying. "Is that hers?" Frank nodded. "Yeah, I haven't looked at it since she died. Thought it was time." Carla pulled up a stool and sat beside him. "Find anything interesting?" "More questions than answers," Frank admitted, holding up the photograph. "She wrote Silver Ridge on the back of this. You mentioned that place earlier." Carla leaned in, studying the photo. "I remember it well. It's a quiet town, full of history. My parents used to take me there when I was a kid. There's something about it. It feels like it's stuck in time." Frank looked at her, then back at the box. "I think I need to go there. See if I can find out what she didn't tell me." Carla smiled gently. "I think you should. Sometimes the only way to move forward is to understand where you came from." Her words resonated with him. Carla, despite her struggles, seemed to have an unshakable belief in the power of connection, both to people and to the past. "Do you want company?" Carla asked after a pause. Frank raised an eyebrow, surprised by the offer. "Why would you want to come?" She shrugged. "I know what it's like to look for answers, and I've got a feeling you'll need someone to remind you to eat along the way." For the first time in years, Frank laughed, a small, genuine sound that caught him off guard. "Fair enough," he said. Alex tugged at Carla's sleeve. "Can I go too? I like car trips." Carla smiled at her son, then looked back at Frank. "It's up to you." Frank hesitated, but something about the idea felt right. Maybe he didn't have to face this journey alone. "Yeah," he said finally. "Why not?" As Carla and Alex left for the night, Frank locked up the box and placed it carefully in his bag. He stood for a moment in the quiet garage, staring at the photograph of his mother. Tomorrow he would set out for Silver Ridge. For the first time in years, Frank felt a glimmer of purpose. Whatever he found, he knew one thing for certain: this journey would change him. The early morning light cast a golden hue over the road. As Frank adjusted the rearview mirror, Carla sat in the passenger seat, holding a thermos of coffee, while Alex was securely strapped in the back, clutching his favorite toy car. The hum of the car engine blended with the faint strains of a country song on the radio, creating a calm rhythm that matched the quiet anticipation filling the air. Frank hadn't taken a road trip in years, and certainly not one with company. His routine rarely strayed from the garage and his modest home, but this journey felt different, necessary. "You've been quiet," Carla said, breaking the silence. Frank glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "Just thinking," he said, "about Silver Ridge." "Yeah," Frank admitted. "I don't even know what I'm looking for. Just answers, I guess." Carla nodded, taking a sip from her thermos. "Sometimes the answers you find aren't the ones you expect, but they're the ones you need." Frank smirked at her insight. "You sound like you've done this before." "I've had my share of looking for closure," Carla said, her tone softening. When my husband passed, I spent a long time trying to make sense of things. Eventually, I realized that some questions don't have answers. You just have to make peace with what you find. Her words lingered with Frank as they drove. He couldn't tell if they comforted him or added to his unease. The landscape gradually changed as they neared Silver Ridge. Rolling hills gave way to clusters of trees, and the occasional farmhouse dotted the horizon. Alex, who had been quiet for most of the trip, pressed his face against the window, his excitement building. "Is this where we're going?" he asked, pointing at a sign that read, "Silver Ridge, 2 miles." "Almost there," Carla said, turning to smile at her son. When they entered the town, Frank was struck by its charm. Silver Ridge looked as though it had been plucked out of another era. The main street was lined with brick buildings, their signs painted in vintage script. A small park sat at the center of town, complete with a fountain and benches where older residents chatted leisurely. "It's like time forgot this place," Carla said, echoing Frank's thoughts. Frank pulled the car into a parking spot near a diner with a red and white striped awning. The smell of coffee and fresh-baked pies wafted out as they entered, the door jingling with the sound of a bell. The diner was bustling, but not chaotic. Booths were filled with locals reading newspapers or chatting over plates of eggs and bacon. A waitress, clearly in her 70s, moved gracefully between tables, balancing trays with the ease of someone who had done this for decades. "Let's grab a booth," Carla suggested, guiding Alex to a seat near the window. Frank followed, feeling slightly out of place but too focused on his mission to care. He pulled the photograph of his mother from his pocket, the edges worn from handling. The elderly waitress approached their table, her apron dusted with flour. "Morning, folks. What can I get you?" Carla smiled. "Coffee for me, juice for him," she said, nodding toward Alex. "And whatever he wants," she added, gesturing to Frank. "Just coffee," Frank said, his voice low, as the waitress turned to leave. Frank hesitated. "Ma'am," he said, his voice halting. She paused, looking at him curiously. "Do you recognize this woman?" Frank asked, holding up the photograph. The waitress leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she examined the picture. Her expression shifted, a mix of recognition and something deeper, sorrow perhaps. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "She was my mother," Frank replied. "Do you know her?" The woman set her tray down on the table, pulling out a chair to sit. "Your mother," she repeated, as if testing the words. "Her name was Margaret, wasn't it?" Frank nodded, his chest tightening. "I knew her," the woman said. "She worked here for a time, but mostly she was up at the Langford estate just outside of town. She was the housekeeper there." "The Langford estate?" Frank asked, leaning forward. The woman nodded. "Big place, beautiful, but there was always something about it that didn't sit right with me. Margaret was a sweet girl, but one day she just disappeared. Didn't tell anyone why, just left. We all thought something must have happened." "Did she ever mention anything? Say why she left?" Frank pressed. The woman hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I can't say for sure, but there were whispers. The Langfords, they kept their affairs private. If Margaret left in a hurry, it wasn't without reason." Frank sat back, digesting her words. The Langford estate. The name felt heavy, like a lead weight pressing on his chest. "Do you think someone there might know more?" Carla asked, breaking the silence. The waitress nodded slowly. "If anyone knows the truth, it'll be the Langfords. Though, good luck getting them to talk. They've always been a secretive bunch." She stood, picking up her tray. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she added before disappearing into the kitchen. As they left the diner, Frank couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. The photograph, once a comforting memento, now felt like a doorway to something he wasn't sure he wanted to walk through. "Are you okay?" Carla asked, sensing his tension. Frank nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. "We'll head to the estate tomorrow," he said, his voice firm. Carla placed a hand on his arm. her touch grounding him. "We'll figure it out," she said. Frank looked at her and then at Alex, who was happily playing with his toy car. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't entirely alone. The Langford estate loomed in the distance as the narrow road wound its way through the forest. The once grand mansion, partially hidden behind overgrown hedges and towering trees, had an air of faded elegance. Its ivy-covered walls and peeling paint gave it a haunting beauty, a stark reminder of a past that refused to fade completely. Carla leaned forward in her seat, taking in the sight. "Wow," she said softly, "this place is something else." Frank gripped the steering wheel tighter. His stomach churned as he pulled the car up to the rusted iron gates. The photograph of his mother, now folded neatly in his jacket pocket, felt like a weight against his chest. Alex, ever curious, pressed his face to the window. "It looks like a castle," he exclaimed. Frank managed a faint smile but said nothing. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the gate, his boots crunching on the gravel. A weathered sign hung crookedly on the gate. "Private property. This must be it," Carla said, stepping beside him. Frank nodded, his gaze fixed on the mansion beyond. He took a deep breath and pushed open the gate. The hinges groaned in protest, echoing through the stillness of the estate. The walk to the front door felt longer than it was. Weeds sprouted between the cobblestones of the driveway, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth. When they reached the door, Frank hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" Carla asked gently. Frank nodded, though his heart pounded in his chest. He knocked firmly. The sound reverberated through the house, and for a moment there was silence. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. The door creaked open, revealing a man in his early 30s. He was tall and thin, with sharp features and piercing grey eyes. His clothes, though casual, had an air of refinement that suggested he didn't belong to the small town of Silver Ridge. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone wary. Frank stepped forward. "I'm looking for answers about my mother. She worked here a long time ago." The man's expression darkened slightly. "Your mother?" Frank nodded and pulled the photograph from his pocket, holding it out. "Margaret." The man hesitated before taking the photo. His eyes lingered on the image, and for a brief moment his guarded demeanor faltered. "She was here," he said finally, his voice quieter. "But that was a long time ago." "And you are?" Carla interjected, sensing the tension. "Marcus Langford," he replied, his gaze shifting to her briefly before returning to Frank. "This is my family's estate." Marcus handed the photograph back to Frank, his expression unreadable. "Why are you here now?" Frank hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I found this picture and some letters my mother left. They mentioned Silver Ridge. I need to know why she left here so suddenly." Marcus's lips tightened. He folded his arms and leaned against the doorframe. "This isn't a place people come to revisit fond memories," he said bluntly. "What does that mean?" Carla asked, her tone sharper now. "It means my family has its secrets," Marcus said, his gaze fixed on Frank, "and your mother was part of one of the biggest." Frank's heart sank. "What are you talking about?" Marcus stepped back, gesturing for them to enter. "Come inside. If you really want answers, I'll tell you what I know, but you might not like it." The interior of the mansion was as haunting as its exterior. Dust-covered furniture lined the grand foyer, and the scent of aged wood filled the air. A chandelier hung overhead, its crystals dull from years of neglect. Marcus led them to a small sitting room off the main hall. He motioned for them to sit, but remained standing himself, his arms crossed. "My grandfather, Charles Langford, owned this estate back when your mother worked here," Marcus began. "She was the housekeeper, a kind woman from what I remember. I was just a child, but I remember her smile." He paused, his expression darkening. "Then one day, she was gone. No goodbyes, no explanation, just gone. My grandfather wouldn't Talk about it, but everyone knew something had happened. Like what? Frank asked, his voice tight. Marcus hesitated. There were rumors, whispers that my grandfather and your mother had a relationship. It was scandalous, especially for a family like ours. But no one could confirm it, and my grandfather refused to discuss it. Frank felt a surge of emotions, confusion, anger, disbelief. Are you saying my mother left because of him? I don't know, Marcus admitted, but I wouldn't be surprised. My family wasn't exactly welcoming to outsiders, especially not someone in her position. Carla placed a comforting hand on Frank's arm, grounding him as he processed Marcus's words. Is there anything here that might help us find out more? She asked. Marcus sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. There might be something in the attic. Old records, letters, things my grandfather kept. But if you're looking for closure, I can't promise you'll find it. Frank stood, his jaw set. I need to see it. Marcus nodded reluctantly. Fine, but be prepared. My grandfather wasn't known for his kindness. As Marcus led them up the creaking staircase toward the attic, Frank felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. Each step seemed heavier than the last, the weight of his mother's hidden past pressing down on him. When they reached the attic, Marcus unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was dimly lit, filled with dusty trunks and stacks of yellowed papers. This is it, Marcus said, stepping aside. Whatever you're looking for, it's somewhere in here. Frank took a deep breath and stepped inside, determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it might be. The attic smelled of dust and time, its air heavy with the faint scent of decaying paper and forgotten memories. The dim light from a single bulb cast long shadows across the room, highlighting stacks of boxes, trunks, and disorganized piles of yellowing documents. Frank took a slow step inside, his heart pounding as if it were reacting to the secrets buried within these walls. Start wherever you like, Marcus said from the doorway, his tone indifferent but his expression tense. Frank didn't respond. He felt the weight of Carla's steadying hand on his shoulder before she moved past him, picking up a small wooden box from a nearby table. Let's see what we can find, Carla said, her voice soft yet purposeful. The group began their search. In silence, the only sounds the rustling of papers and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Frank carefully opened an old trunk, its hinges squealing in protest. Inside, he found neatly stacked letters tied with red ribbon, each one bearing the Langford family crest. These look important, he muttered, pulling the bundle out. Carla leaned over, her curiosity piqued. Do you think these could mention your mother? Frank untied the ribbon and began sifting through the letters, his brow furrowing. The correspondence was mundane, estate expenses, formal invitations and legal documents, until he reached one with his mother's name on the envelope. The letter was addressed to Eleanor. Frank's heart skipped a beat as he read his mother's handwriting, the words written with care. Eleanor, I don't know how much longer I can stay here. The tension is unbearable, and I fear for my safety. You've always been my confidant, and I need your advice. Please, let's meet soon before. It's too late, Margaret. Frank's hand tightened around the letter as he read it again, trying to absorb its weight. Who's Eleanor? He asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. Marcus, who had been leafing through a stack of photographs, looked up, his brow furrowed. I don't know, he said. The name doesn't mean anything to me. Frank shot him a skeptical glance, but decided not to push the issue. Instead, he turned to Carla, who was holding a tattered journal. We need to find out who she is, Frank said. Later that afternoon, they left the mansion with more questions than answers. The tension between Frank and Marcus simmered as they walked to the car. Carla, sensing the need to refocus, suggested they head into town to ask around. Silver Ridge, with its quaint charm, seemed an unlikely place to hold dark secrets. Yet as they stopped at various shops and spoke to locals, the name Eleanor yielded no leads until they entered a small antique shop near the edge of town. The shop was a treasure trove of forgotten trinkets and vintage curiosities. Frank barely noticed the rows of ornate clocks and dusty books as he approached the counter, where an elderly woman was sorting through a collection of jewelry. She was elegant, her grey hair swept into a neat bun, and her sharp eyes darted up as they entered. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady and refined. Frank hesitated, unsure how to begin. He pulled out the letter and placed it gently on the counter. "I'm looking for someone named Eleanor. My mother mentioned her in this letter." The woman's expression softened the moment she saw the handwriting. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the letter, her eyes scanning the words. "I'm Eleanor," she said quietly, looking up at Frank with a mixture of surprise and sorrow. "And you must be Margaret's son." The room seemed to shrink as Eleanor's words sank in. Frank stepped closer, his pulse quickening. "You knew my mother?" Eleanor nodded, folding the letter carefully. "She was my friend," she said. "A kind, brave woman. We used to meet here in town away from the estate. She confided in me about everything." "What happened to her?" Frank asked, his voice almost a whisper. Eleanor hesitated, glancing at Carla and Marcus before returning her gaze to Frank. "Your mother was caught in the middle of something she couldn't control. Charles Langford, Marcus's grandfather, took an interest in her. It was more than a working relationship, and it made others in the family furious." "Others?" Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp. "Yes," Eleanor said, meeting his gaze. "Your grandmother, to be exact. She didn't take kindly to your grandfather's attentions toward Margaret, and she wasn't subtle about letting your mother know her place." Frank's fists clenched at his sides. "What did she do to her?" Eleanor sighed deeply, her elegant demeanor faltering. "Your mother never told me everything, but she said she received threats, notes, warnings to leave the estate or face the consequences. She was terrified, not just for herself, but for you." "For me?" Frank asked, his voice breaking. Eleanor nodded. "She left because she didn't feel safe, and she wanted to protect you, but I think there's more to it than even I know." The room fell silent as the weight of Eleanor's words settled over them. Marcus, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "My grandfather wasn't perfect," he admitted, his voice strained. "But my grandmother, she could be cruel. If she was involved in this, we need to know." Eleanor looked at Marcus, her expression unreadable. "I think it's time you learned the truth about your family, Marcus. Your grandfather wasn't just infatuated with Margaret. He wanted to change everything for her, and that threatened the foundation of this estate." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Frank's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of his mother's past. "What do you mean?" Frank asked, his voice trembling. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with both sadness and determination. "If you want the truth, you'll have to confront the legacy of the Langford family, and that means digging deeper into what Charles left behind." The air in the Langford estate attic was still, heavy with the scent of aged paper and varnished wood. Frank knelt beside a large trunk, the creak of its hinges echoing through the dimly lit space. Marcus stood nearby, his arms crossed, watching, with a mixture of unease and curiosity as Frank sifted through the contents. Carla, ever the steady presence, carefully thumbed through a stack of fragile letters on a nearby table. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he lifted a bundle of yellow documents tied with a faded ribbon. The topmost sheet bore an elegant script, unmistakably written by Charles Langford himself. "Found something?" Marcus asked, his tone more cautious than curious. Frank nodded, holding the paper up to the light. "It's a letter," he said, his voice low. "Looks like it's from your grandfather." The three of them gathered around as Frank read aloud. The letter, written in meticulous handwriting, began as an expression of frustration with the Langford family's rigid expectations. Charles described the weight of his family's legacy, the pressure to marry someone of equal standing, and his growing disdain for their obsession with appearances. But the tone shifted as he mentioned, "Margaret, she is unlike anyone I've ever known, kind, genuine, and unburdened by the pretensions that define this family. I want to build a life with her, away from this estate and its suffocating traditions. I only fear what my decision might cost her." Frank's jaw tightened as he read the last sentence. The words felt like both a promise and a warning, laden with a foreboding that matched the tension in the room. Marcus exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "So it's true," he muttered. "My grandfather really did want to leave everything behind for her." Carla glanced between the two men. "But he didn't," she pointed out. "Something stopped him, or someone." Frank met Marcus's gaze, his eyes hard. "Your family." Marcus flinched but didn't argue. They continued searching, the weight of the revelation hanging over them. Carla found a journal buried beneath a stack of ledgers, its leather cover worn and cracked. She opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with Margaret's handwriting. "Frank, look at this," she said, beckoning him over. Frank leaned in, his breath catching as he recognized his mother's neat script. The journal entries painted a vivid picture of her time at the estate. She wrote about the beauty of the mansion, the kindness of Charles, and the growing tension with the Langford matriarch. "She watches me constantly, as if waiting for me to slip up. Her disdain is palpable, and her warnings are becoming harder to ignore. I fear she'll do something drastic if Charles doesn't relent." Frank's hands shook as he read the words. "She was afraid," he murmured. Carla placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "She was also brave," she said gently. As they delved deeper, Marcus pulled out a small stack of letters from a drawer. Among them was another note from Margaret, addressed to Charles. It was short but striking. "I can't stay here any longer. The threats have become too much. I won't risk my safety or my child's for this. If you truly care for me, you'll understand why I have to leave." Frank froze, the words piercing through him. "She left because of me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus, for once, seemed at a loss for words. "She did what she thought was best," Carla said firmly. "She made the hardest choice any parent can make." Frank turned away, his emotions swirling, guilt, anger, and a deep ache for the mother who had borne so much for his sake. The discovery of a locked box pulled him from his thoughts. The small chest was tucked in a corner of the attic, its surface covered in dust. Charles Langford's initials were engraved on the lid, and the lock appeared rusted but intact. "What's in there?" Frank asked, his voice sharp with urgency. Marcus crouched beside him, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's been here as long as I can remember." "Do you have the key?" Carla asked. Marcus shook his head. "If it still exists, it's probably buried somewhere in all of this." Frank wasn't willing to wait. "We'll break it open if we have to," he said, his determination overriding any hesitation. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but whatever's inside might not be what you're hoping for." Frank stared at the box, his heart pounding. "I don't care," he said. "I need to know." The attic grew silent again as they prepared to open the box. Frank's hands gripped the lock, his resolve firm despite the uncertainty of what lay inside. Whatever truths were hidden here, he knew they would change everything. The attic was silent except for the soft scraping of the lock as Frank worked to pry open the box. The tension in the room was palpable, each of them holding their breath as the rusted mechanism resisted his efforts. With a final sharp twist, the lock snapped, and the lid creaked open, revealing the contents within. Inside the small wooden chest were neatly arranged items, an old pocket watch, a small stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and a leather-bound journal. Beneath them lay a folded envelope, its edges worn with time. Frank reached for the envelope first, his fingers trembling as he slid it open. The handwriting was unmistakable. Charles Langford's elegant script, written with precision and care. He unfolded the letter and began to read aloud, his voice tight with emotion. My dearest Margaret, I've spent countless nights wrestling with the decisions that lie ahead. This estate, this family, none of it feels like it belongs to me anymore. My heart and my future belong with you, though I fear what breaking away might cost us both. You've brought light into this house, into my life, in ways I never thought possible. I want to leave all of this behind and start anew with you. But I see the shadows gathering. My wife suspects my intentions, and the whispers among the family grow louder every day. I know she will not let us go without a fight. I've arranged for a fund in your name at the bank in Silver Ridge. It's not much, but it should be enough to help you and the child find a safe place, far from here. I hope you'll accept it as a token of my love and as a step toward the freedom you deserve. Yours always, Charles. Frank's voice broke as he finished reading, the words settling heavily in the air. He set the letter down, staring at it as if it held the answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. He was trying to help her, Carla said softly, breaking the silence. Marcus, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. He wasn't just defying the family, he said, his voice low. He was defying everything the Langfords stood for. That kind of decision, it would have been unforgivable. Frank turned to Marcus, his eyes blazing. And yet your family didn't stop at forgiveness, did they? They made her life hell. Marcus flinched but didn't argue. I can't change what they did, he said quietly. But I can help now. If this fund still exists, we should find it. Frank hesitated, the weight of the letter pressing on him. But Carla's steady gaze reminded him that he didn't have to face this alone. Let's go, he said, his voice firm. The bank in Silver Ridge was a modest building with a weathered brick facade, its interior filled with the soft hum of conversation and the faint clatter of typewriters. Frank approached the counter. The letter from Charles clutched tightly in his hand. We're looking for a safety deposit box, he told the teller, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. The teller, an older woman with kind eyes, examined the letter carefully before nodding. It's been a long time since anyone accessed this box, she said. But it's still here. Please wait a moment. Frank's heart pounded as she disappeared into the back. Carla stood beside him, her calm presence a quiet reassurance, while Marcus lingered nearby, his expression unreadable. When the teller returned, she handed Frank a small key and led them to a private room. Inside was a metal box, its surface gleaming under the dim light. Frank unlocked it with shaking hands and lifted the lid. Inside the box was a bundle of cash, neatly stacked and bound, and a second envelope, marked simply with the name Frank Franks. Breath caught as he picked up the envelope, his mother's handwriting instantly recognizable. He opened it carefully, unfolding the letter inside. Her words were clear and direct, each sentence carrying the weight of her love and sacrifice. My dear Frank, if you're reading this, it means you've found your way back to Silver Ridge and uncovered a part of my life I never had the courage to share with you. I hope you'll understand that everything I did was to protect you. The choices I made weren't easy, but they were necessary to ensure your safety and your future. Charles was a good man, but the world he came from was dangerous for someone like me, and for you. I left because I couldn't bear the thought of you growing up under the shadow of those who would harm us to preserve their power. Leaving him, leaving this place, was the hardest thing I ever did. But I don't regret it, because it meant giving you a chance at a better life. I hope this fund helps you find the freedom and happiness I always wanted for you. And I hope, wherever this journey takes you, you'll carry my love with you, always. Frank folded the letter, his chest tight with emotion. He sat back in his chair, clutching the paper as tears pricked his eyes. Carla reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. "She loved you more than anything," she said softly. Frank nodded, unable to speak. For the first time in years, he felt the full weight of his mother's sacrifices and the immense strength it had taken for her to make them. As they left the bank, Frank held the box close, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. The fund was more than just money. It was a testament to his mother's resilience and her unwavering hope for his future. Marcus walked beside him, his usual aloofness replaced with a quiet determination. "What will you do now?" he asked. Frank looked at him, his resolve hardening. "I'll honor her memory," he said, "and I'll make sure no one else has to pay the price she did." Carla smiled, her pride in him evident. "You're already on your way," she said. For the first time in a long while, Frank felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just uncovering the past, he was building a future, one that would honor his mother's love and sacrifice. The Langford estate seemed even more foreboding as Frank, Carla, and Marcus returned from the bank. The fading daylight cast long shadows across the overgrown grounds, and the air felt heavier, charged with the weight of what they had just uncovered. Frank carried the contents of the safety deposit box in a small satchel, his mother's final words echoing in his mind. "This place gives me the creeps," Carla muttered as they stepped through the front door. She glanced at Alex, who had stayed behind in town with a trusted neighbor, and felt a wave of relief that he wasn't here to witness what they might uncover. Marcus led the way, his usual aloofness replaced with an air of determination. "If there's more to this story, we'll find it," he said, his voice low. "But you need to be prepared for what you might learn." Frank's jaw tightened. "I'm past being scared of the truth." They made their way to the second floor, the old wood creaking underfoot as they reached a hallway lined with portraits of Langford ancestors. Their stern faces seemed to watch them, a silent reminder of the family's imposing legacy. Marcus stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall, its frame slightly warped with age. "This room hasn't been touched in years," he said, pulling a key from his pocket. "It belonged to my grandparents." The door opened with a groan, revealing a space that had been frozen in time. The furniture was draped in white sheets, and the air was thick with dust. A grand wardrobe stood against one wall, and a desk sat near the window, its surface cluttered with papers and personal effects. "This is where we start," Marcus said. Frank approached the desk, his gaze falling on a stack of ledgers and loose photographs. The photos depicted life at the estate, elegant parties, posed family portraits, and glimpses of the staff, including his mother. He picked up one image of Margaret standing near the garden, her smile radiant despite the stiffness of the scene. "She looks so out of place," Carla said, peering over his shoulder. "She was," Marcus admitted, his tone heavy with regret. "My grandmother made sure of that." Frank glanced at Marcus, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "What exactly did your grandmother do?" Marcus hesitated before motioning to a trunk near the wardrobe. "She kept a journal," he said. "It's in there." The trunk was old but sturdy, its brass latch resisting slightly before yielding. Inside, they found a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Frank opened it carefully, his hand steady despite the rising tension. The entries began innocuously, accounts of daily life at the estate, notes on the garden, and mentions of visiting dignitaries. But as he turned the pages, the tone shifted. Margaret continues to overstep her place. Charles's fascination with her is becoming a problem, one I will not tolerate. She needs to be reminded of her position or removed entirely. Frank's grip on the journal tightened as he read aloud. The entries became increasingly vitriolic, describing confrontations with Margaret and explicit threats designed to force her to leave. "I've made it clear to her that she is not welcome here. If she has any sense, she'll take my warning seriously. The Langford name will not be tarnished by her presence." Carla's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "She threatened her," she said, her voice trembling. Frank set the journal down, his anger boiling over. "She didn't just threaten her. She made her life unbearable. She pushed her out." Marcus leaned against the wardrobe, his expression pained. "I always thought my grandmother was harsh, but this is cruelty. She was protecting." "Her image," Frank snapped. "She didn't care about who she hurt in the process." As they continued searching the room, Marcus pulled open a drawer in the desk, revealing a collection of letters and small keepsakes. Among them was a key, its intricate design matching the lock on another drawer. "This might be it," Marcus said, holding the key up. Frank took it without hesitation, his pulse quickening as he inserted it into the lock. The drawer clicked open, revealing a small bundle of documents and another leather-bound journal, this one marked with Charles Langford's initials. Frank opened the journal, flipping through its pages. It was filled with personal reflections, sketches, and plans for a future far removed from the estate. But one passage stood out. "I've tried to shield Margaret from the worst of it, but my wife's determination to see her gone is relentless. I fear what she might do if Margaret doesn't leave soon. I only hope Margaret can find peace and safety far from this place." Frank's vision blurred as he read the words. Charles had known the danger, but hadn't been able to stop it. The discovery left the room in silence. Frank stared at the journal, his emotions a tempest of anger, sorrow, and determination. Marcus broke the silence. "There's more here," he said quietly. "More secrets, more damage. But if we keep looking, we might find something that redeems him, or at least explains why he couldn't protect her." Frank looked at Marcus, his expression hard. "I don't need redemption for your family," he said. "I need answers for mine." Carla stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Then we keep searching," she said. "But not just for the past, for what comes next." Frank nodded, his resolve solidifying. The Langford estate had taken so much from his mother, but it wouldn't define him. He would uncover the truth, not to dwell in it, but to ensure her sacrifices weren't in vain. As he turned back to the desk, his eyes caught on a locked drawer they hadn't yet opened. "We're not done," he said, gesturing toward it. Marcus's brow furrowed as he examined the drawer. "It's been sealed for as long as I can remember," he said. "Then, it's time we open it," Frank replied, his voice steady. The room was eerily quiet as Frank stood before the heavy oak desk, the old key in his hand. The ornate lock on the hidden drawer gleamed faintly in the dim light, daring him to uncover the secrets it held. Marcus and Carla stood nearby, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. "Are you ready for this?" Carla asked gently, her voice breaking the silence. Frank nodded, though his chest felt tight. "I need to know," he said, sliding the key into the lock. With a soft click, the drawer released, and Frank carefully pulled it open. The scent of aged paper rose to meet him, mingling with the faint scent of cedar. Inside were several neatly folded letters, a small leather-bound notebook, and what appeared to be a rolled-up piece of parchment. Frank reached for the letters first, his hand steady despite the weight of the moment. The handwriting was unmistakably Charles Langford's, the elegant script flowing across the page. He unfolded the first letter and began to read aloud. "My dearest Margaret, I write this, knowing it may never reach you. My love for you has grown, stronger with each passing day, and with it my resolve to leave this place behind. The Langford name holds no meaning for me without you by my side. I have sketched out a plan, a way for us to escape this suffocating legacy and begin anew. The path will not be easy, but I believe in us. I believe in you. Together, We can break free of the chains that bind us to this place and find a life where our love can flourish without fear. But I am wary. There are eyes and ears everywhere, and I fear my intentions have been discovered. If anything should happen to me, know that my love for you and the child will never waver. Yours always, Charles. Frank lowered the letter, his throat tight. The words painted a vivid picture of a man deeply in love, but trapped by the weight of his family's expectations and the hostility of those around him. "There's more," Carla said softly, nodding toward the other letters. Frank unfolded. Another, dated shortly before his mother's sudden departure from the estate. This one was shorter, written with haste. "Margaret, it's not safe here anymore. I fear my plans have been exposed, and my wife's anger grows by the day. Please, for your sake and the child's, leave as soon as you can. I will do everything in my power to protect you, but I cannot promise that it will be enough. Always yours, Charles." The weight of the letters settled over the room like a heavy fog. Frank placed them gently back in the drawer, his mind racing. He was trying to protect her, Carla said, her voice trembling, but it wasn't enough. Marcus leaned against the wall, his usual composure shattered. "My grandmother must have found out about his plans," he said. "She wasn't just trying to force Margaret out. She was trying to destroy her." Frank clenched his fists, his anger barely contained. "And she succeeded," he said bitterly. Beneath the letters, Frank found the rolled-up parchment. He unfurled it carefully, revealing a detailed sketch of an escape plan. It showed routes leading away from the estate, safe houses marked along the way, and instructions for securing passage to a distant town. Charles had thought of everything, except how to shield Margaret from the fury of the Langford matriarch. "This wasn't just a fling," Marcus said, staring at the sketch. "He was ready to give up everything for her." Frank's voice was cold. "And your family made sure that didn't happen." As the discoveries sank in, Marcus turned to Frank, his expression solemn. "I can't change what they did," he said. "But maybe we can do something good with what's left of this place. The estate doesn't have to be a symbol of cruelty and control anymore." "What are you suggesting?" Frank asked, narrowing his eyes. Marcus took a deep breath. "We could turn it into something meaningful, a community space maybe. A place for people who need a fresh start, like your mother needed." Carla's eyes lit up. "That's a beautiful idea," she said. "It could honor her legacy." Frank hesitated, his emotions warring within him. Part of him wanted to leave the estate and its painful memories behind, but another part saw the potential in Marcus's proposal. "We'll see," Frank said finally. "But this place won't just be a shrine to the Langford name. It'll be something real, something that matters." As they prepared to leave the room, Frank's gaze fell on the bottom of the drawer. Tucked into the corner was a faded photograph, hidden beneath the other documents. He picked it up carefully, his breath catching as he saw the image. It was a picture of Margaret holding a baby, him. Beside her stood Charles Langford, his hand resting protectively on Margaret's shoulder. Frank stared at the photograph, his mind racing. "Why would he keep this?" he murmured. Carla leaned in, her brow furrowing. "Frank, do you think he could have been your father?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Frank's heart pounded as he looked at Marcus, who seemed as shocked as he was. "I don't know," Frank said finally, "but I'm going to find out." The photograph sat on the table between them, its faded edges and soft focus unable to dull the clarity of the figures it depicted. Margaret, serene and smiling, cradled a baby, Frank, in her arms. Beside her, Charles Langford stood tall and proud, his hand resting gently on Margaret's shoulder, his expression one of quiet determination. Frank stared at the image, his mind racing. The implications were impossible to ignore. He finally broke the silence. "Marcus," he said, his voice steady but low, "did your grandfather ever mention anything about Me? Marcus, seated across the table, shook his head slowly. No, he said, his tone regretful, but I was just a child when all this happened. I never knew what went on behind closed doors. Carla, sitting beside Frank, leaned forward. If this is true, if Charles was your father, it changes everything, she said. Frank exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. It doesn't change what my mother went through, but it might explain why she was willing to sacrifice so much. She must have loved him, even if it cost her everything. The next morning, the trio returned to the Langford estate to dig deeper. Marcus led them to a smaller archive room tucked behind the library, filled with meticulously kept family records. Together, they sifted through documents, searching for anything that could provide clarity. Amid the papers, they found correspondence between Charles and his lawyer, detailing his intent to revise his will to include Margaret and her child. One letter, dated just weeks before Margaret fled the estate, hinted at his growing fears. I know my decisions will not be accepted by my family, but I cannot abandon Margaret or the child. If anything happens to me, ensure they are cared for. Frank's hands trembled as he read the words. He tried to do the right thing, he said, but it wasn't enough. Marcus nodded solemnly. My family's obsession with control overshadowed his good intentions. That's why this place needs to change. It can't just be a monument to their power. It has to stand for something better. Later that week, Marcus announced a town hall event to share their plans for the estate's transformation. The idea was ambitious, to turn the Langford property into a community centre that would provide resources for families in need, inspired by Margaret's resilience and kindness. The estate's grand hall, once a place of exclusivity and wealth, was transformed into a welcoming space filled with local residents. Frank, dressed in a simple shirt and jeans, stood at the podium, his heart pounding as he faced the crowd. He took a deep breath and began. My name is Frank, he said, and this estate, this family holds a history I never wanted to face, but it's a history that shaped who I am. He paused, glancing at the photograph resting on the podium. My mother, Margaret, worked here years ago. She was strong, kind, and brave in ways I never fully understood until now. She made sacrifices no one should have to make. All because she believed in giving me a better life. Frank's voice cracked, but he pressed on. This estate took so much from her, but now it's time for it to give back. We're going to turn this place into something meaningful, a resource for those who need a fresh start, just like she did. The room was silent for a moment before the applause began, growing louder until it filled the hall. Carla, standing near the edge of the stage, beamed with pride. Marcus, standing off to the side, nodded in quiet approval. As the event wound down, residents approached Frank to share their support and volunteer to help. The sense of community was overwhelming, and for the first time, Frank felt a sense of peace. But as the last guests left, Marcus approached him with a small folder in hand. His expression was unreadable. I found this in the archives, Marcus said quietly. It was tucked into one of my grandfather's journals. Frank took the folder, opening it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a paternity test dated shortly before Margaret left the estate. The results were clear. Charles Langford was his biological father. Frank stared at the document, his breath catching in his chest. Carla stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. Frank, she asked gently. He looked up at Marcus, his mind reeling. Why would he keep this hidden? Marcus shook his head. Maybe he thought he could protect you, or maybe he was afraid of what my grandmother would do if she found out. Frank clenched the paper in his hand, his emotions a storm of anger, sorrow and newfound understanding. He was my father, he said finally, but he couldn't protect her or me. Carla's voice was steady. But you can take what you've learned and do what they couldn't. You can build something better Frank nodded slowly, his resolve hardening. "I will," he said. "For her, for both of them." Frank stood in the grand hall of the Langford estate, now transformed into a vibrant community centre. Sunlight poured through the freshly cleaned windows, illuminating the room that once bore the weight of exclusivity and secrecy. Today, it was filled with the hum of life. Children laughing in the corner, volunteers arranging books in the new library, and neighbours chatting as they painted the final walls. He walked slowly across the polished wooden floors, his heart full, as he took in the sight. This was no longer a place of isolation or pain. It had become a sanctuary of hope, a symbol of what could rise from the ashes of the past. The journey to this moment had been anything but easy. The revelation that Charles Langford was his biological father had left Frank reeling, his emotions tangled in a mix of anger, sorrow, and acceptance. For days, he had wrestled with the knowledge, revisiting every memory of his mother through this new lens, but in the end it was her words that guided him forward. In her final letter she had written, "No matter what truths you uncover, know that you are loved. You are not defined by where you come from, but by the choices you make and the people you hold close." Those words had become his anchor. Carla appeared beside him, her warm smile breaking through his thoughts. She held 2 cups of coffee, handing one to him. "It's finally coming together," she said, glancing around the room. Frank nodded, taking a sip. "Yeah, it's more than I ever thought it could be." "You should be proud," Carla said, her voice soft. "Your mother would be." Frank looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him. "I think she would," he said. "She gave up so much to make sure I had a chance. This feels like a way to honor that." Carla reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're doing more than honoring her. You're building something that's going to change lives, just like she changed yours." Frank smiled, a small but genuine expression that spoke to the peace he was beginning to find. At the center of the hall, a large display case held photographs and mementos from the estate's past. Frank approached it, Carla following close behind. Inside were the 2 photographs he had struggled to reconcile. One of Margaret holding him as a baby, standing beside Charles, and another of her in the garden, her radiant smile untouched by the weight she carried. Beneath the photos was a simple plaque that read, "In honor of Margaret, whose kindness and courage continue to inspire." Frank traced the edge of the case with his fingers, his chest tight with emotion. "She deserved more," he said quietly. Carla nodded. "And now, so many others will get more because of her." As the day wore on, the community center buzzed with activity. Marcus arrived, sleeves rolled up, carrying a box of supplies. He had thrown himself into the project with an energy Frank hadn't expected, his remorse for his family's past fueling his determination to make amends. "I think we're almost ready for the grand opening," Marcus said, setting the box down. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Almost? I thought we were ready yesterday." Marcus smirked. "Perfection takes time." The 2 shared a rare laugh, a small but significant step toward bridging the gap between them. That evening, as the last rays of sunlight bathed the estate, in a warm glow, Frank found himself alone in the quiet hall. He pulled his mother's final letter from his pocket, unfolding it carefully. "My dear Frank, if you're reading this, it means you found the courage to uncover the truth. I hope it has brought you some measure of peace, even if it wasn't easy to face. You are my greatest joy and my greatest strength. Every choice I made was for you, to give you a life filled with love and possibility. Remember, family isn't just where you're born, but where you belong. And you, my son, belong to a legacy of kindness and resilience. Carry that forward, and you will make me proud. Always with you, Mom." Tears blurred his vision as he read the final lines, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude, of love, of hope for what lay ahead. The next morning, the Langford Community Centre opened its doors to the public. Families poured in, laughter and conversation filling the air. Frank watched from the entrance as children explored the new library and parents signed up for workshops and programs. Carla stood beside him, her son Alex tugging at her hand as he ran off to join the other kids. She turned to Frank, her smile soft and full of pride. "This is just the beginning," she said. Frank nodded, his gaze steady. "It is." As the sun rose higher, bathing the estate in light, Frank felt a profound sense of peace. His mother's sacrifices had not been in vain. Her legacy lived on, not just in the walls of the community centre, but in the lives it would touch for generations to come. And as he stood there, surrounded by the warmth of new beginnings, her words echoed in his heart. Family isn't just where you're born, but where you belong. Frank knew now, more than ever, that he had found where he belonged. Wow, what an incredible journey, right? Frank's act of kindness truly reminds us of the power of generosity and how it can lead to life-changing moments. Before you go, I'd love to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and let's see how far this story has traveled. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Join our growing community where we share more inspiring stories like this one. Your support helps us continue spreading positivity and hope. Thank you for being here, and I can't wait to see you in the next story.